Welcome to Hearthside Lore. The Tomb Kings of Nehekhara. Introduction. The ancient realm of Nehekhara was once the greatest civilization of men in the world. But hundreds of years before the rise of Sigmar, the treachery of the great necromancer Nagash almost destroyed and enslaved this mighty realm. Brought back to immortal unlife by arcane magic, the Tomb Kings of Nehekhara continue to lead their undead armies, fighting to protect their mighty empire from the depredations of the lesser races, and expand their dominion even further. The Rise of Nehekhara. Countless centuries ago in the land of Nehekhara, far to the south of the old world, there rose a mighty civilization of man. It was at its most powerful 2.5 millennia before the coming of the barbaric hero deity Sigmar, a time when the other men of the world were still primitive and savage. The ancient myths and legends of these people, carved on the tombs and monuments of their cities, say that the Nehekharans were so favored by the heavens that the first of them were nurtured and taught by the gods themselves. Greatest of the cities of Nehekhara was Khemri. The other cities were each ruled and governed by their own kings, though they all were loyal and paid tribute to the king of Khemri itself. Together these kings conquered the tribes in the surrounding lands, drove back the greenskins, and ruled from the western desert to the eastern sea. At the height of their power, they had expanded and conquered lands as far north as what is now the Empire, far south into the steaming jungle of the Southlands, as well as to the north and east into the Darklands. Their fleets of war galleys terrorized the great ocean, raiding up and down the coast and causing terror wherever they went. The legacy of King Settra. It was Settra, the first priest king of Khemri, who conquered the other kings, making Khemri the preeminent city of Nehekhara and beginning the golden age of his kingdom. He was a powerful warrior and a mighty leader, feared across half the world. Rather than taking satisfaction in his successes, Settra was aggrieved that death would one day rob him of his lands and power. Determined to overcome this intolerable situation, he ordered his priests to find a way to ensure that he would live forever. Settra was consumed with his quest to find immortality and to live in the paradise he had created for all eternity. The priests of Khemri did as Settra bade them, and for years they brewed potions and recited incantations determined to decipher the riddle of everlasting life. They traveled into unknown lands in search of the secret that would overcome death. In their research, the priests learned much, but soon realized that true immortality lay beyond their power. They were naturally reluctant to reveal these limitations to their king, and continued to search for the secret of eternal life, though they held little hope of discovering it. The priests wisely decided to keep some of what they discovered to themselves. By means of incantations learnt through mysterious and ancient sources, the priests used their knowledge to extend their own lives for centuries. Nevertheless, they could not halt the passage of time indefinitely, and were merely postponing the inevitability of death while their bodies became frail and withered. The Pyramid of Settra. Despite the best efforts of the priests, Settra could not be saved from death. When Settra finally perished full of anger and pride to his last breath, powerful incantations were intoned over his body, and he was embalmed with great ritual. Preserved against decay, the body of Settra was entombed deep beneath the earth under a mighty pyramid of shining white stone. The Lich Priest of Khemri had never discovered a way of avoiding death, but they believed that with proper magic and careful preparation, the dead might eventually be able to return to life in imperishable bodies. The Lich Priests told Settra this as he lay dying, promising him eternal life upon his awakening. For thousands of years afterwards, they and their kind tended the flames in his tomb, nurturing his spirit with sacrifice and magic in preparation for the day of the awakening. Their lives extended long beyond those of other mortal men, and because of their longevity and unsurpassed wisdom, the Lich Priests of Khemri enjoyed dominion over the land of Nehekhara, second only to that of the kings themselves. The time of kings. After Settra came many kings, though there was never one as powerful or influential. Upon their death, these too were entombed within towering pyramids to await when they would reawaken into paradise. Over time, the shining cities of the dead outgrew the meager cities of the living. All the efforts of the people were expended in building and maintaining the tombs of the kings, and the entire culture of Nehekhara came to revolve around preparing the way to their reawakening. Soon, lesser nobles demanded similar rights, and their tombs were built alongside the royal pyramids. Throughout the whole land of Nehekhara, monuments of the dead arose above the cities of the living. This long age was a time of prosperity for Nehekhara. Armies of chariots, strong bowmen, and highly disciplined warriors marched to war against each of the king's enemies. In the west, the crude desert nomads were subjugated, and their chieftains forced to send a tribute to Khemri in the form of slaves, gold, and precious stones. In the north and south, the kings fought many battles against tribes of greenskins and barbaric men. These wars brought much wealth and many exotic materials to build the royal tombs. None could stand against the might of Nehekhara, and they ruled supreme across the lands. However, tragedy struck the Nehekharans, and the entire society was soon to be destroyed by one man. The Treachery of Nagash. The fall of the land of Nehekhara and the tragic destruction of its people was brought about by the ambition of a single twisted sorcerer. Once he held the honored position of High Priest of Khemri, yet he began to corrupt the religious incantations of the Order of Priests, and betrayed the King of Khemri, his own brother. Filled with greed and pride, Nagash coveted the throne held by his brother, and set into motion a plan to become king as well as high priest. One night, as the clouds covered the moon, he murdered the young king, entombing him alive within the Great Pyramid of Ketep. The next morning, blood still staining his hands, he placed himself on the throne, and none dared confront him. The reign of Nagash was a time of terror for all the people of Nehekhara. The usurper king sought to increase his own power by means of devilish sorcery, a blasphemy that the people of Nehekhara felt certain would incur the wrath of the gods. He conjured evil demons to do his bidding, and learned many dark secrets in this way. In order to build his own tomb, he demanded great quantities of gold and slaves to be sent in tribute to Khemri. Stone the color of ebony was brought from afar, and soon the black Pyramid of Nagash towered above all others, rising hundreds of meters into the sky. So great was the tribute brutally exacted by Nagash that starvation racked the lands, and the great cities fell into ruin. Eventually, the kings of the other cities of Nehekhara railed against Nagash, and their armies attacked Khemri. The priest-king Nagash used his infernal powers to raise a legion of long-dead warriors. This was the first time that the dead were made to walk at the will of another, and the horror of it caused many to flee before the undead armies. After a titanic battle, Nagash was eventually defeated. Some thought him destroyed, yet he managed to escape to the northeast to plot his revenge. The cursed Black Pyramid was abandoned, and for centuries it remained a haunted place shunned by all. For hundreds of years, the kings continued to rule Nehekhara, yet the corruption of Nagash had tarnished the royal line of Khemri, and his treachery was never forgotten. His blasphemous dabbling in cursed sorceries spread to the city of Lahmia, whose queen embraced the malign magic and consorted with demonic powers. She had drunk from the elixir of Nagash, extending her life indefinitely, yet cursing her for all eternity. Fearful of the wrath of the gods, King Alcadizar made war on the tainted queen, leading a massed army against Lahmia. Hundreds of chariots raced across the land ahead of mighty phalanxes of archers and spearmen. The might of Lahmia was smashed, and the queen fled, accompanied by those she had embraced into her cursed vampiric existence. Nagash, who had managed to escape destruction centuries earlier and was residing in the mountains to the northeast of Khemri, recognized the spawn of his own ancient evil and was gladdened by the corruption of the lords of Lahmia. He welcomed them, and the vampires became his captains, fell creatures clad in dark shadows, whose actions were guided by the strength of their master's will. Nagash sent the vampires to make war upon Khemri, and he vowed to turn the entire world into a kingdom of the dead. At their back came the dead warriors of a mighty army, skeletons drawn from their tombs by the power of Nagash's sorcery. War and strife assailed Nehekhara for years on end, and the land was irredeemably scarred. But Nagash underestimated his former countrymen. Alcadizar the Conqueror was the greatest general of his age, and led the unified army of Nehekhara against Nagash's evil for all the long years of battle. Finally, the undead hordes of Nagash were pushed back, yet the evil sorcerer himself still walked the land. His corrupt, necromantic magic was still new and not yet perfected, and his power was not as great as it would later become. The Vengeance of Nagash. Such was Nagash's bitterness, so great the potency of his thwarted ambition, that he chose to end all life in Nehekhara, rather than see anyone else hold power over the land. He polluted the clear water of the River Vitae, poisoning it until the water turned thick and dark, tainting the lands that relied on its life-bringing waters. Forever after, the river was known as the River Mortis. Pestilence spread rampantly across the land of Nehekhara, and those who succumbed to the terrible plagues soon began to outnumber the living. Weeping for his lost people, Al-Qadazar sat upon his throne as his kingdom was destroyed by a foe that he could not fight. He watched as his friends and advisors died, then his children, and finally his wife, Khalida, named after the revered queen of Liberas. As Nagash's undead forces once again attacked Nehekhara, there was only a meager defense, for most of the population had already perished. Finally, Al-Qadazar was captured and dragged away to rot in a dungeon cell beneath Nagash's fortress. Filled with insane visions of power, Nagash began to cast the greatest and most terrifying spell he had ever conceived. As he chanted within his fortress to the northeast of Nehekhara, the sky for hundreds of miles began to darken and the ground shook. As his spell reached its crescendo, a great wave of power surged from the sorcerer's body, washing over the lands of Nehekhara and stealing the life from everything in its path. Crops shriveled, and animals perished within seconds. The last people of Nehekhara fell to the ground, their skin withering as if they had aged a century in the blink of an eye. Within minutes, there was not a single living creature in the entirety of Nehekhara. Nagash planned to raise the entire population of Nehekhara, an unstoppable army of the dead that he could use to conquer the world. While Nagash was lost in his dreams of triumph and drained of power, Al-Qadazar, the last living king of Nehekhara, was mysteriously freed from his prison by a group of hunched, heavily cloaked creatures. A powerful blade was put into his hands, and he stumbled into Nagash's throne room where the twisted sorcerer was recovering from his greatest expenditure of energy. A mighty battle ensued, and Nagash was eventually cut down by the last king of Khemri. Al-Qadazar disappeared from the history books, filled with horror at the obscenities he had seen, and having witnessed the death of his beloved realm. The kingdom of the dead. The only things that moved within the dead cities were the withered and ancient lich priests. Their bodies, already extended far beyond their natural lifespan, seemed to be unaffected by the curse of Nagash. Though they could not guess it yet, they had become immortal at last, though in a manner none could have foretold. Nagash's foul magic penetrated the tombs of the kings and reverberated throughout the charnel pits of the dead city. His cruel spell affected these dead kings and their minions in a different manner, and they rose from their resting places. From long-forgotten crypts, skeleton warriors burst forth ready to do their king's bidding. After centuries of entombment, the stiffened corpses of heroes and ancient generals stirred. While the skeletal warriors were little more than automatons awaiting their lord's directions, the kings and princes awoke from their long sleep of death, with their memories and faculties intact, due to the incantations of preservation performed on their embalmed bodies. They emerged from their tombs in horror. They had expected to arise resplendent from death into an eternal paradise, yet their bodies were little more than crumbling husks. Their land was in ruin, and their kingdoms shattered. The ambition and pride that had driven the Nehekharan kings in life still resided in their ancient bodies, and they instantly set out to reclaim their empires as best as they could. There were hundreds of kings, for the tradition of embalming the dead had existed for countless generations, and those who were great and powerful in life were now but one among many. There were long battles in the necropoli amongst the kings, and thousands of skeleton warriors were destroyed. In Khemri, the battle between rival kings lasted for 2 days before the tomb of Settra opened, and the king himself, first and mightiest of all the kings of Nehekhara, marched from his resting place, accompanied by thousands of his personal guard. He struck down dozens of lesser tomb kings, destroying them utterly, and his tomb guard overwhelmed all opposition. Before long, the kings of Khemri bowed their heads to him, the greatest of all kings, and soon he had reconquered all of Nehekhara. Settra commanded the surviving Lich priests to explain to him why the awakening had gone awry before the right and proper time. The Lich priests cowered before the outraged king, and told the history of Nehekhara since his passing, over 1,000 years previous. As best they could, they told Settra of the spell that the foul Nagash had cast, cursing Nehekhara for all time. Settra listened with a controlled rage simmering within him. Once he had learned all he could from the Lich priests, he commanded that the kings return to their eternal rest. The Lich priests were expelled from his sight, for Settra, in his vanity, believed that his own powers far surpassed those of the priests who had lied to him. They were given the duty of watching over the tombs and Nehekhara itself, and to awake the kings as needed. Settra vowed that he would stay vigilant, taking stock of the world and waging war as was his wont. In particular, he would watch for the hated Nagash, who had cursed him, for he knew that the necromancer might yet reappear in the world, and Nagash's magic could still threaten his immortality. So it was that Nehekhara became the land of the dead. The Siege of the Dead. The early morning sun sparkled from the tips of 20,000 spears, glittering across 60,000 gilded bows, and shone radiantly from 5,000 chariots. The army of Alcatazar the Conqueror was spread out across the dunes like a sea of gold and white. At their back was the massive city wall of Khemri, 70 feet of black granite and green marble rising directly from the sands of the desert. And beyond lay the great city itself, picked out in blues, yellows, and white. The black pyramid loomed over the landscape, casting its great shadow across the lands that had once quailed in fear at the mere mention of a name. Nagash. Now Alcatazar stood in defiance of the ancient enemy, his army mustered from the furthest corners of Nehekhara. He had the finest charioteers from his own city of Khemri, deadly archers from Zandri, and the elite Sphinx Legion from Qatar. His right flank was guarded by the Sun Court of Prince Imrethepis, guardians of the gates of Numas. On his left were the chariots of the Jackal Squadron of Mahrak, long-time advisors of the traitorous Lahmians. At the front of Alcatazar's army stood trumpeting Tuscus, The dark-skinned Ebonian auxiliaries gathered in loose formations around their massive gray war beasts. Such a host had not been gathered for many centuries. But now the ancient threat returned. Word came from the east that at the head of the dead army rode Archon, sorcerer of the Black Tower, thrice cursed, undying general of Nagash. With him came Wusran, dread blood drinker of Lahmia, who was impervious to mortal weapons and could defeat 100 men single-handedly. At their back was the army of Lahmia, raised from their graves to march to war once again. If Alcatazar were to fail in his duty today, all of Nehekhara would be plunged into an era of darkness and death. The vampires would feed upon his loyal subjects. His great palaces would become charnel houses, and the long sleep of his ancestors would be defiled by black sorcery. Alcatazar watched the rising sun. As he contemplated the battle to come, the distant sky began to darken. A great cloud of blackness seeped over the horizon, leeching all the light and vitality from the air. The sun itself turned dim and soon was lost, and the chill of night swept across the desert. He could sense the fear of his soldiers and heard their disquieted murmurings. With unnatural speed, the dark storm clouds gathered overhead. In the gloom that was left, the army of the dead advanced. In macabre mockery of the Nehekharan host, chariots of melded bone and sinew raced alongside skeletal cavalry. Archers, with their flesh long stripped by carrion, advanced with bows bent. Above the sea of bone, ragged banners fluttered in an unearthly breeze, and the air itself warped and shifted with magical energy. Alcatazar was filled with a deep anger as he watched the shambling horde approach. He thought of the terror that his people had lived under for centuries, the silent threat that had loomed like the shadow of the Black Pyramid over numerous generations of Khemrians. Here and now he would end that threat. He would crush Archon's army and cut off the head of Wusran. He would mount their corpses on the front of his chariot and ride at the head of his host across the mountains to raze the city of Lahmia. Raising his golden-edged sword into the air, he signaled the advance. Tales from the Oasis. Welcome to my humble camp. Please be seated and refresh yourself. One of my serving girls will see to all your needs, for here at the Oasis of 1,001 Camels, all are friends. This paradise of the desert is the last refuge in a God-forsaken land. Here the living may seek rest, safe in the knowledge that come dawn, they will still be breathing. Out there in the great desert of Nehekhara, the dead outnumber the living 1,000 to 1, and only the brave or the foolish dare trespass on their land. Are you brave or foolish, my friend? My name is Suli, and I am but a humble trader, but my knowledge of these lands is great. And perhaps before you venture into the desert of the dead, you would take heed of my words. Countless times I have traveled through the lands of Nehekhara, and yet still each time my belly fills with fear. Just half a day's ride from this very spot lies the ruins of Bel Alad. Once it was a thriving city, and the home of my family. that was before the coming of the sleepless ones. As a child, I had heard stories of the dead that did not rest. They were as fanciful as the stories of gins in bottles, or of carpets that could sail the skies. Then one accursed summer, the breeze that blew the fresh air cooled by the great ocean suddenly changed direction. For months we were ravaged by an unbearable hot wind that brought with it sandstorms from the east. The fields that surrounded the city failed to produce a harvest, and mighty dunes grew around the city walls. Yet even as the people of the city began to perish from starvation and thirst, we still remained hopeful that the storms that burned our throats and flayed our skin would abate. Then, on the eve of the festival of Jaff, I witnessed such horror that to this day it still haunts my dreams. Crowds lined the streets in celebration. Then, without warning, the skies grew dark, as if summoned by foul sorceries. A swirling dust storm raced towards the city walls. It reached up to the very heavens themselves, sweeping our cattle into the skies. My people desperately sought shelter, but even as the storm passed, our torment was not ended. From the east there came a swarm of insects, the dull hum of their wings growing louder and more intense. With each second they drew closer. With savage ferocity they attacked us, and I lie to you not, some of these beasts were larger than a man. They burst from the ground itself, and the streets became a living carpet of death. They engulfed my people, and those who still could fled in fear. Only a handful of us survived, and of those few, only I, Suli, dares venture back to these lands. It was a few years later that I returned, a young lad in the employ of my uncle as a camel driver. Our small party had traversed the desert for many days, at times making camp with the nomad tribes, who know each and every place to gather water from the accursed dry sands. We had been hired as guides by the manservant of a collector of antiquities for a considerable sum. They wished to make their way to the ancient ruins of the once great city of Khemri. Little could I believe my eyes when I first saw the great pyramids. For many miles a huge black monolith loomed on the horizon, dwarfing a second golden pyramid beside it. Even in the harsh glare of the desert sun, I felt a coldness surround me as I stared at that dark construct of he who shall not be named. As we drew closer, I was astonished to find that the entire city consisted of hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller pyramids. When I say small, please understand even the most insignificant of these constructions reached 100 feet into the sky. They littered the desert like a small mountain range, and from the top of a dune, I could make out a vast labyrinth of alleyways interlacing between the ancient tombs. We made camp in the old city, insignificant in size compared to the necropolis of the dead. It is the safest place in the region, for they say the dead do not venture within its walls. The stranger who had hired our services left the camp at sunset with just a whip for his protection. A reckless urchin, I could not help but follow him. He and his servant crossed the dunes and entered the forbidden city. I was eager to follow, but my uncle commanded that I stay. 3 days passed, and we grew weary of waiting. My uncle told me that we would leave come morning, and with this knowledge that night I crept away from the camp into the necropolis. The tracks of the stranger were easy to follow, for in the city of the dead even the wind is silent. After many hours of weaving in and out of the narrow streets, sometimes following the tracks in circles, I stopped dead in front of a pyramid. Its entrance lay open, but fearful to enter, I hid outside, hoping that the stranger would emerge with a hoard of ancient gold and gems. Many hours passed, and I fell asleep, dreaming of the wealth I would soon possess. I was woken by a hand on my shoulder. Sleepily, I opened my eyes, thinking it to be our heroic employer. Instead, before me stood a horror that will be engraved upon my mind to my dying day. A being dressed in ceremonial robes. Its brow adorned with a fine gold crown stood over me. She, and I use the word loosely, was clad in half-decayed bandages, and her 2 lifeless eye sockets stared into my very soul. A bloodied, jewel-studded blade hung at her side. In one hand, bony fingers grasped the severed head of the stranger. I leapt up, my mouth uttering prayers to the gods, and sprinted away, running through dozens of skeletal figures who snatched at my clothes. Arrows fell about me, but I was fast and had youth as an ally. Weaving and dodging through the streets, I escaped from the terrible vision. I do not know how many hours I ran through the vast labyrinth. I can only thank the gods that I found a route out from the necropolis, for there are many who have not been so fortunate. My uncle found me lying face down in the sands, exhausted and panic-stricken. I told him of the dead that walked and of the fate of the stranger. We left immediately, and to this day my uncle has never returned to the lands of the dead. After such an encounter, why do I still travel these lands? I ask myself that same question over and over, whilst awaiting the return of the unfortunate stranger. My head had filled with visions of gold and treasure. From that moment, I think my fate was sealed. Riches, my friend, are a strong antidote to fear. And believe me, I have seen the riches that these barren lands hide. Many are the expeditions that I guide through these deserts. The seemingly empty lands are filled with an abundance of paradises, buried beneath the deep sands. It is all there for the taking. You just need a good guide and a heart of stone to conquer the fear that will strike through your soul. Should you wish for a comparatively small fee, I will guide you through the desert. Without my help, you will surely not even make it past the pools of despair. What foul magics created those mirages, I know not, but they have led many to their deaths. As your supplies of water begin to run low, suddenly a lush oasis appears before you. Men are driven mad as they strive to reach these false visions. Only 4 days ago I passed the remains of one such poor individual. His canteen was filled with sand, and he had died scooping handfuls of the desert into his mouth, thinking it to be cool water. I see from your expression that you still doubt your need of my assistance. Even should you make it past the endless mirages and visions, then where would you head? To the north, perhaps, where lie the ruins of Xandri. Here the great ocean meets the desert, and at the mouth of the river Mortis lies this ancient port. Once the great and noble king, Amenemhetem, ruled over this city. During his reign, he built a vast fleet and sailed the oceans, conquering the lands across the seas in the name of Ualat, the vulture god. His kingdom extended deep into the lands to the north, and under his rule Xandri became a fabulous and wealthy place. Now the city is all but destroyed, and the streets are quiet. The seas around Xandri are a different matter, though. When the Dark One woke the Tomb Kings, they waged war on each other. In death, as he had in life, Amenemhetem was contented to be ruler of the oceans. I have seen the king's ships sail the coast with my very own eyes. Ancient vessels, but still as glorious as they were when the king still lived. Even in death, it is said he continues to raid the world, his ships ceaselessly sailing the seas, rowed by skeleton slaves, doomed to an eternity at the oars. No coast is safe, and even the most experienced captains know to steer clear when they sight his fleet. The coast around the Mortis Delta is filled with the sunken wrecks of pirate ships that have foolishly attacked his fleet in search of treasure. Perhaps you would strike out to the east, for here lies the city of Numas. It is a treacherous route, and one which the traveler should tread carefully. You would find yourself passing the springs of eternal life. However, although your canteens would by this time be running low, do not feel tempted to drink of the water. I have witnessed a man do so, and trust me, the immortality he was granted was not one that I envy. No sooner had his lips touched the water than I stood horrified, as before my eyes his skin withered, and he perished in mere seconds. I was rooted to the spot as I watched his skeleton form march into the desert, heedless of my presence. Now I imagine he serves the Tomb Kings, an undying slave at their command. In Numas they know my name and welcome me, but I am one of a handful of people that is allowed passage through the city gates. In Numas, life has returned to the desert, and once again crops grow around the city. Numas is a marvelous place, and over many centuries the pyramids have been restored to their former glory. But do not be fooled into thinking that the people there would welcome you. The Scythians were once a nomad tribe who came to Numas to worship their god. They believe that the Prince of Numas is a manifestation of their god, and so have dedicated themselves to his service. Each day they tend to the necropolis, guarding the tombs from those who would seek to defile them. The prince now rules over the living and the dead, and both live in strange harmony. These black-robed nomads patrol the deserts, warning Prince Tutankhamun of any intruders to his realm. In return, the nomads are allowed to live in the city, under the protection of soldiers who do not sleep. Though why any would feel safety when their lives are guarded by those who are dead is beyond me. When the prince goes to war, his chariots race alongside the white Arabian steeds of the Scythian warriors, living and dead fighting side by side. I have heard it said that when a Scythian warrior dies, his body is left in the desert for the carrion to pick his bones clean. After 40 days and nights, his skeleton is carried back to the tombs where he is prepared so that he may continue to serve the prince in death as he did when he was alive. The realm of Nehekhara is indeed massive. Past the mountains lies the city of Mahrak and Beramas, and of course the famed temples of Lahmia. It was there that Queen Neferhata ruled over the people for centuries. To get to these cities, though, you must first brave the Charnel Valley, also known as the Valley of Kings, but named by the nomads the Valley of the Dead. Here at the entrance to the valley lies the magnificent palace of Qatar, built into the very walls of the Canyon Pass. It is a truly awesome sight. I have traveled far and wide across this land, but never seen such a magnificent piece of architecture. Great pillars carved from the valley rock face line the hundreds of steps that lead to the palace gates. Throughout the entire length of the valley are carved colossal statues, representations of the kings and gods. It is said that a powerful priest has taken residence in the palace, and he has learned the secret to bring the statues to life. If you are wise, then you would stay clear of that place. No living soul dares travel through the Valley of the Dead, for of the many who have set forth into the valley, none have ever returned. Even should you survive, ask yourself what you seek in Lahmia, for only evil has been born in that land of woe. There is one place that no amount of money could tempt me to take you. Be wary of marching to the south, for there an evil exudes across the desert lands. It is here that Archon the Black built his tower. Archon, who fought at the side of he who shall not be named. Archon, who slew countless tribes, and even gave his own life to protect the greatest evil that has ever set foot in this land. After his death, the tower lay dormant, a shattered, empty husk that even the scorpions avoided. Recently, I have word from the nomad tribes to the south that the tower is inhabited once again. No one can be certain who lives in the tower now, as each dawn, when the sun's rays cross the dunes, the tower vanishes from where it stands to appear in some other location in the desert. The nomads say that Archon has risen, and once more seeks to cast his shadow across the land. This is grave news for all, for if Archon the Black has returned, then all should fear, lest his master soon follow. If this is true, then all in this land should take heed. The Tomb Kings who we fear so greatly could soon prove to be our only salvation. The clatter of metal crushing on stone echoed through the corridors of the ancient dust-filled tomb. Inside an ornate gold sarcophagus, the entombed king opened his shriveled eyelids, revealing two black, empty, soulless sockets.
"Leave it, Gribbet. The stuff ain't worth nothing."
A high-pitched, raspy voice called out to its comrade.
"Shut it, Ragwort. The boss likes big swords, and this one is dead shiny."
A second voice called back. Gribbet stepped over the huge pile of fallen spears and shields, carrying a curved golden blade that was as long as he was tall. He scurried up to his goblin colleague, who was rooting around in a chest full of jewelry and gems. Ragwort was already throwing the valuable necklaces around his neck, and only stopped when he felt his knees buckle with the weight. The small dark chamber was suddenly illuminated as the torches on the walls flared into light. Both of the goblins froze, staring at each other, eyes wide in fear. Burdened by their ill-gotten treasures, neither goblin was able to flee fast enough to escape the sword, as it swept down in an arc, severing the heads of the two thieves. With one fell swipe, the bandage-clad figure left the ransacked chamber, walking down corridors that had not been disturbed for centuries. Reaching what appeared to be a blocked passageway, he laid a bony hand on the wall, pressing his long white digits into a recess on the surface. Stone grated heavily on stone as a doorway framed by light appeared before him, the bright glare of the desert sun banishing the darkness of the corridor. From his elevated position high on the pyramid, the Tomb King watched the dust cloud of an army marching to the north, away from his necropolis. The smaller pyramids lay broken, and the once proud colonnade of statues that led to the necropolis had now been unceremoniously toppled. The undead king watched as a lone figure climbed up the steep steps to where he stood. As the ancient human, dressed in fine ceremonial robes, reached the top, he rested his weight on his staff in an attempt to catch his breath. The Tomb King turned to face his servant, addressing him in an ancient tongue.
"Priest, summon my army."
King Far stood unmoving upon his ornate war chariot. In the distance, the Tomb King heard the deep, heavy pounding of tribal drums alerting the orcs to his army's approach. He had experienced the same sound many centuries ago, when blood flowed within his mortal flesh. Back then, those same drum beats had chilled his blood with the thought of the coming battle. Now he felt nothing but cold contempt for these pitiful creatures. In over 2,000 years, they had not developed as a civilization, and he would be glad to purge them from the face of the world. The greenskins poured out from the camp's crude wooden gate. At first, they seemed an undisciplined, shambling horde. But the Tomb King knew better than to underestimate their instinctive warlike abilities. Within minutes, a solid wall of greenskins faced his army and advanced forwards. Guttural chants sounded out over the pounding of the drums as the orcs went to war. From Far's commanding viewpoint, the neat and disciplined ranks of his own army were dwarfed by the advancing, teeming horde.
"Your Majesty."
King Far turned to face the Lich Priest who addressed him.
"What is your will?"
The king turned his crowned, skeletal head towards his archers. He raised his sword, and with that signal the skeleton archers loosed their arrows skyward. Before the first cloud of arrows had descended into the orc ranks, a second volley was airborne. King Far watched with satisfaction as arrows that appeared to be sailing over the heads of the enemy twisted in mid-flight, careening down into the center of the orcs' formations. Dozens fell with the first volley, followed by more seconds later. Within minutes, the once solid wall of orcs was in disarray as the onslaught of enchanted missiles continued to fall. Orcs began to flee back towards their camp, and within the first few minutes of battle, it appeared as though the orc army had been defeated. Then from the orc camp came the heavy pounding of hooves on soil. Bursting from the gates rode a mighty orc, mounted on a huge boar and clad in an assortment of thick plate armor. He bawled at the panic-stricken orcs, who now turned once more to face the king's army. Undaunted by the hail of arrows that rained down amongst their ranks, the orcs again marched forward, quickening their pace as they closed in on Far's loyal soldiers. The king signaled to his troops again, and the skeleton archer formations closed their ranks, forming into defensive blocks. Gaps in the solid line had now been opened, and the rumble of wheels and clatter of skeletal hooves sounded across the battlefield as the king's cavalry and chariots rode forwards. Suddenly, a dark shadow sped across the ground, growing larger by the second. Far looked up to see a huge bat-like creature sailing down towards the newly reformed skeletons. With a mighty crash, bones splintered and broke as the creature descended into the midst of his force. He spied a second shadow, and this time could make out the form of a winged goblin diving to his doom. This time, the suicidal creature crashed behind the formation, leaving a bloody pulp of metal, flesh, and canvas on the dusty ground. Far spotted a small line of goblins behind the orc lines, flapping huge canvas wings in anticipation of launching themselves skywards from a huge catapult contraption. Uttering an ancient incantation, Far was more than satisfied to see the ground around the catapult crack and split as a huge scorpion rose from out of the earth. Its massive pincers sliced one of the machine's crew in half, before its immense stinger thrust forwards, repeatedly striking the small goblins who fell to the floor, convulsing as the poison took hold. The sudden attack terrified the doom divers, who ran in panic, flapping furiously in a vain attempt to get airborne and out of reach of the monstrous beast. By now, the orcs were so close to the front line that King Far could see the grisly trophies that hung round their necks. Amongst the teeth and skulls that adorned their necks was the odd gold neckpiece, ancient treasures from Far's own collection. Calmly, the king reached out and grasped a huge flail from a weapon rack on the front of the chariot. It had been a long time since Far had used this weapon, and its weight felt good in his hands. The weapon's ornate carved handle ended with a series of chains, from which hung the skulls of conquered enemies. For a brief moment, the skulls crackled with small flashes of lightning, spurring his steeds into action. Far's chariot rolled slowly forwards, gradually picking up speed. Following his lead, the rest of the army marched as one towards the orcs. The king signaled to the chariot next to him. A gold-armored icon-bearer nodded in acknowledgement and waved his long staff, topped with a crescent and engraved down the length with hieroglyphs that told of the bearer's heroic feats. In life, the icon-bearer had been Far's mightiest champion, and the king's own personal bodyguard. Now in death, he still rode to war at his king's side. The dusty ground to the orc's right flank cracked and split apart as a dozen skeletal steeds rode from the ground itself. They charged into the surprised orc's flank, and with this shock attack, the king signaled for the rest of the army's chariots and cavalry to charge. The decorated constructions smashed into the ranks of the greenskins, gold-trimmed wheels crushing the orcs beneath them. Orcs fled before the combined onslaught, and spears thrust through their unprotected backs. Far's chariot rolled over many bodies before smashing into the boar riders, who had been taken by surprise by the severity of the charge. Far spotted the orc war boss, and steering the steeds towards the massive foe, he swung his flail in a wide arc above his head. The war boss leapt off his boar to avoid the collision. A crunch of wood followed as the chariot splintered at the impact with the huge beast. Within seconds, the orc was on his feet and swinging his massive, crude choppa at Far's head. The orc's blow fell wide, and the king brought his flail down in a powerful sweep. With a sickening crunch, the skulls smashed into the orc before he could strike, shattering even his thick-boned head. Seeing their war boss fall was more than the greenskins could take, and as their courage failed them, the cowardly savages fled to the safety of the mountains. As his warriors picked the jewelry off the corpses and carried it back to the Lich Priest, King Far surveyed the land around him. During his reign, he had cleared much of this mountainous region of orc tribes. Soon the time would come when he would conquer these lands again. But for now, he was satisfied that the orcs would think long and hard before disturbing his sleep once more. Back in the ruins of Mahrak, the torches in the small tomb chamber slowly burned out, and the recovered treasures in the alcoves of the pyramid vanished in the darkness. Encased in his sarcophagus, King Far once again closed his eyes. His arms crossed upon his chest, and grasped in one hand was the flail, now adorned with a new skull, with huge fang-like teeth. The story of the awakening of King Far. The legions of the undead. Tomb Kings. Lord of the earth, Lord of the sky, ruler of the four horizons, mighty lion of the infinite desert, great hawk of the heavens, radiant sun, king of the shifting sands, reigning till the end of time, eternal sovereign, vanquisher of enemies, he who holds the scepter, Khemri Kara, Settra the Imperishable. A selection of the names and titles of Settra, greatest Tomb King of Khemri. Tomb Kings are the ancient and long-dead rulers of the land of Nehekhara. There have been countless kings during the long history of that ancient land. Each city was ruled by a separate dynasty, and these were ousted from power and replaced by others over the span of centuries. The Tomb Kings regularly waged war upon each other to spread their influence over the entire land of Nehekhara. Greatest of all the kings were those of Khemri, which was the largest and most proud of the ancient cities. It became established early on that whoever ruled in Khemri was the mightiest king in Nehekhara, to whom the other kings would pledge allegiance and offer tribute. All the kings shared the same lust for worldly wealth and power, and the same ambition to defy death. To this end, they founded the mortuary cult in order to reawaken them after death. They directed the building of great pyramids surrounded by extensive necropoli as strongholds for all eternity, and ordered that they be mummified and entombed within to preserve their physical bodies for all time. The Tomb Kings are mummified corpses awakened and inhabited by their undying spirits. Their skeletal bodies are dried husks, preserved with pitch and wrapped in bandages inscribed with magical incantations. Bedecked in gleaming crowns and the regalia of kingship, they retain all the majesty that they exuded while alive. Amulets and talismans of gold inset with precious stones hang around their necks, and they often wear the breastplate of a military commander strapped over their death shroud wrappings. Entombed within the same chamber is their kingly chariot and steeds, ready for them to ride forth from the tomb shaft into the light of day. Revived by the rituals of their priests, the Tomb Kings awake from their death sleep possessing all the ambition and craving for power that they had in life, and are bent on restoring their ancient realms. If this means the conquest of former wide dominions, then this shall be done. For a Tomb King's army, loyal even in death, rises from its rest at his call and is ready to march at his side once again. Tomb Princes are the sons of the Tomb Kings. Each of the kings of ancient Nehekhara kept extensive harems, and so had many sons. Only one of these princes of the blood could succeed his father to the throne. As for the others, some died heroically in battle, and their bodies were brought home to be mummified and entombed in a place within the king's pyramid, as befitted captains of high rank. There they await in the sleep of death, ready to recommence their military duties at the time of their awakening. Others lived on to serve their brother as officers, and were thus entombed in his pyramid to continue to serve him after death. The Tomb Princes rest in their vaults beside the great tomb chamber of their sovereign, in an eternal council of war, waiting for the moment of awakening, when they shall resume command of their contingents. Those few who through jealousy or intrigue attempted to usurp the throne were denied the privilege of mummification, and their bones were thrown to the carrion of the desert. Lich Priests. Revered One, Venerable One, Lord of Secrets, High Priest of the Temple of Years, Keeper of the Pyramid of Eternity, Interpreter of Mysteries, Prophet of the Lord of the Tomb, Master of Awakenings, Bearer of the Serpent's Staff, Khatep, the Enduring. Names and titles of Khatep, Lich High Priest of Khemri. In their desire to defy death, the kings of Nehekhara founded the mortuary cult and appointed the priesthood, of which the Lich Priests are all that remain. The priests were commanded to study the arts of mummification and communion with the gods. Steadily, over many centuries, the priests learned how to preserve a corpse from decay until the art of mummification had become very elaborate. They also devised a vast lore of incantations and rituals intended to enable the dead king, as well as the entire court and army, to be awakened from death. The first generations of priests, whose skills and knowledge were rudimentary, died after prolonging their own lives far beyond their natural span. They passed on their knowledge to the next generation of priests, who exceeded them in wisdom and expertise. In this way, their knowledge accumulated until the 5th generation of priests, who did not die, though their bodies slowly withered away until they were little more than living corpses. Thus, the entire priesthood became the Lich Priests, able to officiate the mortuary cult of their king in perpetuity, and they held great power in the land. Indeed, they were the only subjects of the king who could not be executed, since he depended on their knowledge and loyalty in order to live beyond his own death. In this way, the priesthood became a formidable power behind the throne. Each necropolis, with the Pyramid of the Tomb King at its core, had a temple dedicated to the king's mortuary cult. Here resides the Lich High Priests, served by many lesser priests. Only the High Priests have been initiated into the deepest secrets of the cult. The priests have many duties to perform in the necropolis apart from the ritual of awakening, including such tasks as renewing the seals upon the portals of the tomb vaults, remaking inscriptions which have become eroded by wind-blown sand, determining the moment of awakening, and consulting the spirit of the Tomb King by means of oracles. They continue to perform these duties for centuries, because they cannot die a natural death. Little more than long decaying corpses, their dry, wizened skin resembling that of a mummy, is stretched like old parchment over their brittle skeleton. Skeleton soldiers. The mighty army of the necropolis, awaiting the command of their lord, valiant soldiers all who rise up at the call of their lord and master. Hieroglyphic inscription over the tomb pits of the skeleton legions of Settra. The mighty armies of the Tomb Kings, made up of regiment after regiment of valiant soldiers, swore an oath of loyalty before the gods to serve the king beyond death. Thus the bones of those soldiers who perished in battle were collected from the field of war and interred in the great tomb pits of the king's necropolis. Those who yet lived after their lord had died marched as if on a victory parade to the necropolis upon the day of the king's entombment. Here they stood in their regiments, ready for death, arranged before the pyramid of their king in ranks, icons held proudly. They were entombed alive. No soldier flinched as the great stones were heaved into position, blocking out the light of the sun. Bravely they stood to attention as the sand was poured into the tomb pits until the tops of their standard poles disappeared from sight. There they remain until the trumpet call of the Lich Priests awakens them, and they once again heed the orders of their commanders. These skeletal soldiers fight in the same manner that they did when living. Highly disciplined in life, the foot soldiers of the Tomb Kings fight in highly organized ranks, turning and advancing in perfect unison. Archers unleash their arrows in great clouds that darken the sky, blessed by the asp goddess, so that they seek out their foes with unerring accuracy. Mounted on the skeletal remains of their once proud steeds, regiments of cavalry race across the open plains to engage their foes, while other, more lightly armored horsemen scout out the movements of the enemy and harass their flanks. These soldiers of the Tomb Kings, loyal for all eternity, continue to practice their ways of war, as they did in centuries long past. Skeleton chariots. The swift charioteers of the king, they who pursue the foes of the sovereign on the day of his awakening. Hieroglyphic inscription over the tomb pits of the skeleton charioteers of Settra. The pride of a Tomb King's army are his charioteers. Nehekhara was the first great civilization of mankind, and the place where men first used horse and a chariot in battle. The ancient armies of Nehekhara included strong forces of swift, lightly built chariots, usually drawn by a pair of horses. These fought in massed units and were considered the elite of the army, and only the nobility were permitted to fight as charioteers. This was considered a great accomplishment. For in ancient Nehekhara, horses had only recently been bred as beasts of war. These elite chariot squadrons were entombed beside the pyramids of the Tomb Kings of Nehekhara, ready to serve their lords upon their awakening, and trample over their foes as they had done in his mortal reign. Admired and respected foes when they were alive, the skeletal charioteers of the Tomb Kings, riding to battle, strike fear in the hearts of all who oppose them. Tomb Guard. Sentinels at the portal of eternity, mighty ones who stand before the king, valiant ones whom none shall pass, guardians of the king's tomb. Hieroglyphic inscription over the tomb pit of the tomb guards of Settra. The bravest and the best soldiers serving the Tomb King acted as his personal bodyguards and palace guards during their lifetime. In respect of this role, they were honored with the privilege of sharing his immortality, and buried close to their king within the regal pyramid itself. Just as they guarded the palace in life, so now they guard the inner sanctum of the necropolis. The prospect of sharing in the immortality of their king and serving him for all time inspired these soldiers to heroic acts of bravery. They would die where they stood rather than retreat, and would charge against the most hopeless odds. Time and again this would bring victory to the king's army, and earn a place in his pyramid for the fallen. Tomb Guard were also honored with partial mummification, though this was nowhere near as elaborate as the ceremonies of preparation which the Tomb Kings and princes underwent. The Tomb Guard were entombed with the finest armor and weapons, as well as gold decorations proclaiming their bravery and devotion. They rest in their sarcophagi, standing upright around the royal tomb chamber. Here they stand to attention as palace guards, until the time comes when they are again needed. If intruders violate the tomb, they will awaken and defend their lord. If the king awakens ready to go forth to conquer and trample the lands of the living beneath his chariot, they arise and form up at his side. Just as the Tomb Guard were once the elite warriors of the Tomb King, the icon bearer was his trusted champion. Only the greatest and most trusted of warriors was given the honor of carrying the king's personal icon to battle. The icon bearer was also the envoy and herald of the Tomb King, given the duty of bearing his lord's commands to distant parts of the realm, and dispense justice in the king's name. Often disputes between Tomb Kings of different cities would be settled by a ritual duel between their nominated champions. and the icon bearer often fulfilled this role. Ushabti. They stand staring into the sun for eternity, the physical embodiments of the everlasting gods. Tremble ye who look upon their divine forms. Inscription at the base of the Ushabti depicting the great gods of Nehekhara, at the entrance to the great pyramid of Rakaf the First. Carved into the likenesses of the many gods and goddesses of Nehekhara, the Ushabti stand as guardian statues around the perimeter of the great pyramid of the Tomb Kings. Standing 3 times the height of a man, they are imposing monuments, and all who pass beneath their shadows tremble. In times of need, the Lich priests imbue the Ushabti with tremendous power through complex incantations and charms. As the chants are completed, the Ushabti step from their plinths and daises, silent and ready to be directed to war. In ancient times, the warriors of Nehekhara took great strength from the fact that the Ushabti fought with them. For who could not be inspired by the physical representation of the gods marching into battle by their sides? It was the Nehekharans' belief that their gods dwelt in the great land in the time before the birth of man. It is said that the span of the deities' lives was numbered in millions of years. After this golden era when the gods walked as men, they became invincible spirits, able to take on any form that they desired. Thus it was that Asaph, goddess of beauty, magic, and vengeance, chose the form of the asp, and Kassar took on the elemental form of the desert wind. Most depictions of the gods in this grand pantheon show them in these powerful forms, and they are commonly carved as guardian Ushabti in the tombs of kings. Some of the most common statues include Jaff, the swift-to-anger jackal-headed god, and Fakth, the deity of the hawk, who is said to be able to see the evil and sins of the dead. Petra, the sun god, was the most widely worshipped of all the numerous divinities, symbolizing eternity and immortality. In the stories recorded in numerous inscriptions, Petra is said to ride his golden chariot across the skies, forever chasing his beloved, the moon goddess. The gods Quaff, Ulatp, and Sokhth took the form of the cobra, vulture, and scorpion, while others chose the crocodile, the abyss, or particular stone formations of the desert. Some divinities took no particular form, and it is these that are the most mysterious and sinister of all. Fa'ah and Usakep are 2 of these gods, said to dwell in spirit form within almighty tombs, buried beneath the sands, and their names are used in the direst of curses and invocations. Tomb swarms. Behold, the dead stinging ones shall come forth from their abodes beneath the sands. Their numbers shall be beyond counting. Part of an incantation used by the high priest Karatut to summon a voracious swarm to consume his enemies, recounted in hieroglyphs in the great necropolis of Bagar. The tombs of the necropoli are infested with the dried husks and shells of countless poisonous insects and other vicious creatures of the desert. Though long dead, the mere presence of the Lich priests and tomb kings fills their empty shells with animation, and they scuttle from their hiding places around the mortuary temples and beneath the sands. The Lich Priests have long since gained mastery over these creatures, and can summon them forth at will through their incantations. They do this to guard the necropolis against intruders, especially tomb robbers. Those who penetrate the labyrinth passages of the tombs risk these swarms appearing seemingly from the earth itself, in an unstoppable wave, biting, clawing, and burying themselves in flesh. The victims are poisoned by hundreds of bites and stings, and are rapidly devoured as the vicious creatures quickly consume flesh, clothing, and bone. Tomb Scorpion. Fear them, guardians of the underworld who stalk among us. Part of a hieroglyphic inscription carved into one of the great tomb scorpions of Numas. Tomb scorpions are powerful creations of the Lich Priest, giant constructs carved and molded into representations of the giant mystical creatures said to guard the entrance to the Nehekharan underworld. They are formed from a combination of materials, stone, wood, and metal, together with the bones and shells of long-dead mighty creatures that are scattered beneath the sands of the desert. Through laborious and precise incantations, the Lich Priests join the materials into a single form. The tomb scorpion serves as a sarcophagus or tomb itself, for the shell of the construct is formed around the cadaverous body of one of the ancient high priests. For reasons unknown, some of these ancient ones no longer respond to the incantations of awakening, and have fallen into what is known as the death sleep. That these beings are truly dead is doubtful, as their power can still be felt exuding from their skeletal bodies. The shell of the inanimate scorpion is inscribed with hieroglyphs of binding, and a ceremony of awakening is spoken. This ceremony lasts from moonrise until the first rays of dawn, and any mistakes or mispronunciations will mean that the incantation will fail. If the ritual has been performed correctly, the tomb scorpion will become infused with the residual power of the priest held within it. Tomb scorpions often stand dormant for centuries on end, and become buried in the shifting sands. When the tomb kings go to war, the Lich Priests send out their call, and the tomb scorpions awake, clawing their way to the surface to fall upon their enemies with mighty claws and stinging tails. It is truly a terrifying sight to behold. The sands shift and part, and the monstrous creations work their way to the surface. Carrion. The carrion of the desert, whose mighty outstretched wings darken the noonday sun on the day of slaughter. Part of an invocation chant of the Lich Priests, used at the Temple of the Sun in Khemri. According to inscriptions, King Nekhef claimed to be the first ruler to use carrion in his army of eternity. These creatures lived in the mountains to the east of Nehekhara, and also the deserts to the west. Their broad wings were said to darken the sky, spreading the shadow of doom upon those dying in the desert. After a great battle, with the slain strewn over the stricken field, the carrion descended and blotted out the light of the sun. Thus it was in ancient Nehekhara that the carrion was seen as a sacred beast that bore the spirits of slain warriors to the sky to fight in endless battles against the demons of darkness. This belief led to the priests burying many corpses of carrion in the necropoli of each tomb king, from the time of Nehekhara I onwards. As the revered birds eventually died out, only those that were entombed remained. At the will of the lich priests, they once again take to the skies, their horrifying forms spreading fear amongst those who feel the chill of their shadow. Bone Giant, that which was stone, arise. Bone and bronze and leather and tar, creature of power, awake and visit destruction on the enemies of Khemri. Part of the awakening ritual performed by the high priest Karnut during the time of the Second Dynasty. In ancient times before the rise of the mortuary cult, many were the legends of mighty beings of immense stature walking the land and smiting all who stood in their path. As the knowledge and skill of the priesthood grew, they turned their talents towards recreating a being of the size and power that the legends spoke of. For who could face such a creation in battle? Thus the first bone giants were painstakingly crafted, formed from all manner of elements, and held together by the powerful incantations of the lich priests. Made to resemble an immense warrior of Nehekhara, the bone giant is armed with traditional weapons and armor on a mighty scale. It is a rare thing to create a new bone giant, and most of those that are at times seen marching to battle alongside the Tomb Kings have been in existence for thousands of years. If one of the constructs is destroyed, its sacred pieces are gathered up and used to recreate it. Outside the ancient cities of Nehekhara, bone giants stand as motionless sentinels, guarding important valley entrances and gateways. Such power is instilled in the bone giants that they do not need the incantations of the lich priests to prompt them into wakefulness, and will react immediately to the presence of unwelcome strangers, striding relentlessly towards them, smashing them into the sand with their heavy weapons. Screaming Skull Catapult. The executioners who decapitate the rebels, they who hurl the wailing heads of the enemies of the king. Inscription above the tomb pit of the skull catapults in Zandri. It is said that Badesh, king of Zandri, claimed to have invented this type of catapult and ordered them to be constructed. He used these in his many wars and had them mounted on his numerous war galleys, which gave him domination of the great river Mortis during his mortal lifetime. When he had extended his rule along the western bank of the river, but had yet to subdue the kings and rebels encamped on the eastern bank, he gathered a great many catapults together and hurled over the skulls of his decapitated enemies who had been captured in earlier battles. This demoralized his opponents and caused their army to lose heart when the final onslaught came. The king wished to repeat this tactic again against other more redoubtable enemies. Therefore he instructed the priests to devise a spell to be written on the skulls of decapitated rebels in hieroglyphic signs that would make them tremble with fear. This the priests demonstrated to the king. They enchanted the skulls so that they screamed hideously as they were hurled through the air. It was the very death scream of the rebel at his moment of execution. The skulls were also daubed in resins that burst into eerie ethereal flames as they flew. The king was indeed impressed, and decreed that henceforth the heads of all rebels would be reserved for these catapults. When the king was approaching death, he gave instructions that the catapults should be entombed as an essential part of his necropolis army, since they had brought him more than one victory in life, and he expected them to do so again beyond death. The successors of Badesh followed this example. Centuries later, other kings who extended their rule over Zandri ransacked the necropolis and found the burial pits containing the catapults. These were looted and taken away for reburial in other necropoli, together with scrolls containing incantations of awakening and hieroglyphs of enchantment to be inscribed on the skulls. Casket of Souls. Damnation eternal awaits those who would disturb his rest. Here be the souls of those that are lost. Inscribed on the casket of souls within the tomb of King Setep. Within the tombs of the mightiest kings there lies a casket sealed with pitch and inscribed with hieroglyphs of malediction and warning. Within this sacred sarcophagus reside the souls of those who have committed the sacrilege of inciting the tomb king's rage. Whether consumed by ravenous tomb swarms, or cut down by the tomb guard, the spirits of those thus condemned have been ensnared by the dire power of the casket, and trapped within it for eternity. Powerful inscriptions ensure that these souls may never leave their binding prison until the moment comes when the casket is opened. If the seals are broken, and the lid opened, blinding light spills from the casket as countless lost souls scream into the air, seeking freedom from the madness and torment of their confinement. Such an escape will never come while the casket is intact, for the pull of the damned sarcophagus is so great that it draws the souls back within no matter how hard they try to fight it. Crazed and desperate, these insubstantial spirits plunge through the hearts and minds of those nearby, hopelessly seeking an escape. As the screaming forms of these souls pass through the physical bodies of living creatures, the life force of that creature is sucked dry. They feel an intense pain deep within them, and their bodies age centuries with every passing second. In mere heartbeats, they are little more than a dried shell, and they fall to the ground. Far worse than physical death, those who perish in this manner are condemned in soul as well as body. As their spirit begins to rise from their fallen body, they too become ensnared by the power of the casket, becoming just another of the countless lost souls held within its unholy confines for an eternity of torment. The spirits affect even creatures that do not truly age or have a soul, as the magical energies that bind them together or keep them on this plane of existence are absorbed. Carried on to the field of battle, a casket of souls is a devastating weapon. For all who look upon it risk eternal damnation and entrapment. Mighty heroes of Nehekhara. King Far. When Settra first began his domination of the kings of Nehekhara, he faced fierce resistance from rival kingdoms. Under his skilled generalship, Settra's armies were able to conquer all opposition before them, until they marched east through the Valley of the Kings. Word had spread of Settra's coming, and one king was determined to defy this all-conquering army. Under his rule, the lands around Mahrak had been scoured clean of the green-skin menace, and the city had prospered. An arrogant and proud leader, King Far deemed himself too important to bow down before any mortal. He was able to ambush Settra's force as they marched through the Valley of the Kings, preventing the army from taking his beloved city. For decades, his people held out, besieged many times by the armies of Khemri, and even with his dying breath he cursed the name of Settra, remaining the only king who refused to pay him tribute. Finally, with Far's passing, Settra's armies were able to conquer Mahrak, and the last free city of Nehekhara fell under Settra's rule. Far was among the first of the kings to rise from his eternal slumber. Upon awakening, such was his fury that his successors had bowed down to the lineage of Khemri, that he broke into the tombs of his descendants as they woke. Ordering their pyramids toppled, he dragged their mummified corpses from their resting places, burning them, and shattering their charred skeletons with his mighty flail of skulls. Even in death, King Far continues to fight against Settra, and his undead legions wage war against all who try to subject him to their will. Sehenesmet, Vizier of Qatar. The tomb city Qatar is famed for its towering statues, many of which are colossal representations of the gods and mighty kings of the past. Sehenesmet, the Vizier of Qatar, has worked for nearly a score of centuries, creating, rebuilding, and caring for these monoliths. Unmatched in this field, Sehenesmet has refined his incantations so that he can animate and control a great many of these constructs at any given time. It is he who inscribed the powerful incantations of awakening and binding upon the towering monoliths that guard the entrance to the famed Valley of the Kings. And his realm of walking statues is talked of in the lands of Araby in hushed tones. It has been said that he has even animated the great stone guardian of Qatar, shaped in a hybrid form of lion and eagle. Now it is even rumored that he has interred himself within the animated body of a giant construct to lend him the strength so that he may undertake more ambitious and grander projects. Prince Tutankhamun. Prince Tutankhamun was the only son of the wealthy king Aachen of Numas, and was famed throughout Nehekhara for his handsome features. Tragically, the young prince was slain before he had even come of age at 15. He had been hunting lions, for he was renowned as a particularly skilled bowman, even when speeding along the plains on his war chariot. Separated from his hunting party, a crude spear hurled by a savage northern tribesman smashed into his chest and threw him from his chariot. Adored by his wealthy father, Prince Tutankhamun was given an elaborate burial. When the young king awoke from his death sleep, he was horrified at his withered skeletal form. According to the Nehekharan beliefs in the afterlife, the gods would bestow each king with a body of gold. Tutankhamun was furious to find this was not the case, and demanded that his priests fashion him such a body. When he arises from his tomb, resplendent in his golden body and death mask, the still living people of Numas hearken to his call, perceiving him as blessed by the gods. When the prince and his army march to war, the people joined behind the icon of Tutankhamun, marching alongside their long-dead ancestors to war. Tutankhamun has led his army to many victories. Fighting in the thick of battle, his golden form deflects even the most powerful attacks. Settra the Imperishable. And behold, the almighty god King Settra did awaken from his sleep of blessed oblivion. His legions, long buried beneath the sands, did arise and stand to attention, awaiting his order. And he did say, "War." And the world did tremble. Of all the kings of Nehekhara, none could match the splendor, cruelty, and arrogance of Settra, first priest king of Khemri. Under his inspired leadership and unparalleled ruthlessness, the many kings of Nehekhara were conquered and forced to pay tribute and acknowledge Khemri as the greatest city of the land. The tribes of the surrounding lands were conquered and the armies of Settra spread far and wide, enslaving all before them. His war fleets ravaged realms across the sea, bringing the terror of the priest king to many distant lands. Settra was a vain and egotistical king, demanding tribute and adoration from all his subjects. And, though he was a tyrannical ruler, Khemri entered an unprecedented golden age of prosperity under his rule. Settra's kingdom stretched across the land, but for all his conquests he was unsatisfied, knowing that one day death would rob him of all he had accomplished. In his arrogance, he vowed that the grave would not claim him, and proclaimed that he would cheat death, setting his wisest and most powerful priests towards working on a means of preventing his passing. The priests journeyed for many years throughout the world, searching for a means of keeping the great king from death, but to no avail. Great was Settra's wrath, and though the priest's magic kept him alive far beyond his mortal span, they could not prevent his death. As he lay dying, the priests promised the great king that it would one day be possible for him to return from beyond the grave and live forever in a golden paradise where he would reign eternally. When the king died, it was with a curse on his lips, and his body was taken to the great Pyramid of Khemri, where he was entombed beneath the earth to await the appointed time for him to awaken. But for the twisted ambition of the evil necromancer Nagash, Settra's plans might have come to fruition. As Nagash's powerful spell coursed across the lands of Nehekhara, legions of warriors and kings from ancient times stirred and rose from their sepulchres. Where the ancient kings had been promised eternal life in a paradise where they would reign supreme, they instead awoke to find themselves clad in rotted vestments and desiccated flesh, with their lands in ruins and kingdoms destroyed. The fires of pride and ambition still burned within their breasts, and they set about reclaiming what remained of their kingdoms. Battles raged throughout Nehekhara until the great Pyramid of Khemri opened, and Settra emerged into blazing sunlight. Great was his fury at this disastrous reawakening, and he set about reconquering his lost realm, overwhelming all those lesser kings who stood against him, and forcing them to swear terrible oaths of fealty. Having passed into the realm of death, Settra knew now that his priests had lied to him and kept much of their magic for themselves. His power was now far greater than theirs, and he cast them from his lands, ordering his vassal kings to return to their tombs and await his call to arms. He would remain awake, king of a devastated land, ready to begin the reconquest of the empire that was once his. Immortality was now his, and the new races that had flourished in his absence would now feel his wrath. High Queen Khalida Neferher. High Queen Khalida, the warrior queen of Libaras, was highly respected across all the lands of Nehekhara and adored by her subjects. Her intelligence, temper, and bravery were as legendary as her beauty, as was her intense sense of honor and justice. Her reign was tragically short, cut down as she was in her prime. All of Nehekhara mourned her passing, for they knew she would have brought great glory to the empire. Khalida was killed by her cousin, Neferher, the Queen of Lahmia, in ritual combat during a great celebratory feast. The sensuously beautiful and alluring Queen of Lahmia had falsely accused Khalida of treason and attempts of assassination, and proclaimed these allegations loudly during a banquet feast. Khalida had risen to defend her honor, and in her anger had refused to nominate a champion, accepting the challenge personally. Neferher desired the death of Khalida, for the warrior queen had grown suspicious of Neferher and her Lahmian court. Indeed, Khalida was right to be suspicious, for Neferher had been studying the blasphemous texts of the sorcerer Nagash, and had drunk from the cursed elixir of damnation. She had been reborn into a cursed existence, becoming the first of the vampires. And if Khalida was not silenced, then Lahmian's deadly secret would become known. The two women fought before the shocked nobility, their blades weaving a delicate and deadly dance. Khalida was a skilled and powerful warrior, and yet she could not match the preternatural speed or unholy strength of Neferher. As she lay on the tiled floor, her blood flowing from a terrible wound in her stomach, Neferher sunk her sharp teeth into Khalida's neck, sucking deeply, biting hard on her own tongue. The Queen of Lahmia placed her lips over Khalida's, and her vampiric blood flowed down the dying queen's throat. As the life began to leave her dying body, Khalida knew that the cursed blood now flowed through her veins. In desperation, she cried out to the gods to save her from the same abominable fate that had taken hold of Neferher. The goddess of the asp heard her pleas and appeared to the dying queen in a divine vision. The blessing of the goddess purified the vampiric taint from Khalida's veins, even as it drained the remaining life from her. In sorrow, she was borne back to Libaras. The priests and priestesses of the asp goddess undertook the burial of the queen, for they recognized that the blessing of their divine mistress was upon her, even in death. Khalida was embalmed and placed in a seated position within a specially made reliquary, within the temple of the blessed Asp in Liberas. There she sits, unmoving, her face concealed behind a beautiful death mask created in her likeness. In times of dire need, when her homeland is threatened, the power of the Asp goddess infuses her ancient limbs. Gracefully, she rises from her seated position and glides across the temple floor, commanding the doors to open with a delicate motion of her hand. Her flesh slowly starts to return to its former beauty, gradually becoming as pale and hard as pristine white marble. As the embodiment of the Asp goddess in full fury, a wave of pure terror rolls over those who look upon her. With divine energy flowing through her limbs, Queen Khalida brings war and death to any who threaten her realm. Inscription on the great obelisk of Khemri, thought to be a recount of King Settra's dying words, as translated by one Alun Gartner. Hail to the mighty tomb guards who stand before me, you who will stand guardian at my tomb chamber for eternity. For I, Settra, Lord and first King of Khemri, will awaken to command you in the paradise that awaits us. Hail to the Ushabti and the Sphinx who crouch beside the monuments of the king. Hail to the commanders of my legions of warriors, leading forth your regiments to join me in eternity. Fill the air with the sound of your worship. Your standards are pleasing to my sight, and that of the gods. See how the sun god shines upon them. Remember them gleaming this day as you enter the darkness of the tomb. Fear not what we must do, and think only of the glory that awaits me upon the great awakening. Look upon my flesh, warriors. Once I was a mighty warrior king, destined to live the life of a god. Yet my flesh withers upon my bones. My frail body succumbs to the ravages of time, and soon death will claim me, but it shall not always be so. In strange eons, even death may lose its grip, and though I march to the tomb, I have the spirit of a king, and you also. Yet you be but mere mortals. You have the invincible spirit of the army of Settra. Turn your heads, my soldiers. Turn your heads and see the fair river Vitae. You will see it again when the world is ready to receive us, and you reclaim that which is mine by right and by birth. We are the glory of Khemri, and shall rise again to fulfill our manifest destiny of ruling this world. Now make ready your weapons, my soldiers, for the time is at hand. Go forth. I command you, go forth in haste, and march with your king to the darkness of the tomb. Make great the name of Settra and Khemri. The darkness draws near, and there are great deeds that remain undone, enemies yet to crush, and raptures yet to rejoice in. So as it is written, so shall it be done. I, Settra, have proclaimed it, and let none dare oppose my will. The Barrow Kings. Scattered throughout the old world and beyond lie ancient cairns, the burial places of early kings and their most loyal warriors. They are the last remnants of an ancient people predating the coming of Sigmar. little is known about them, for they did not record their histories in written form, relying on a tradition of storytelling. These barrows are mounds of earth piled over a tomb, usually accessed by a single entrance. They range greatly in size, and some of the largest can be seen on the skyline for many miles around. Macabre and superstitious stories surround these mounds, and those who live near them go out of their way not to walk in their shadow. Bedecked in bronze armor, rumors say that these ancient kings stride from their burial mounds in the darkness, their warriors, loyal beyond the grave, marching at their side. It is said that the ancient druids of these people, figures of particular power and authority within the society, still walk the earth, directing mysterious powers and incantations against those who would desecrate the ancient king's resting places. Scattered throughout the wilder lands are towering statues, and though weather-beaten and old, many of them still resemble the nature gods and spirits that were once worshipped. It is said that these megalithic structures arise on nights of the new and full moons, to stalk the darkness at the whim of the ancient druids. Some have speculated that there appears to be some link between these people and the ancient Nehekharans, although scholars have thus far been unable to provide much evidence to prove this claim. Mikael looked on as Heinrich closed a gloved hand on a dust-covered goblet. Raising it close to his eyes, Heinrich inspected the vessel, wiping grime from its surface. Apparently satisfied, Heinrich dropped it into the heavy leather satchel worn over his shoulder and shuffled deeper into the crypt. Mikael glanced around anxiously, his torch sending flickering shadows dancing over the walls, and he flinched at the movement. The light revealed all manner of strange carvings on the walls, swirling patterns that entranced the eye, and strange, wide-eyed figures with decorative headdresses. "I think we should go, Heinrich," Mikael whispered, wincing as the sound of his voice shattered the silence. He felt as though the weight of the earth piled above was pressing down on his chest. His breathing was ragged, and despite the chill, his face was wet with perspiration. Heinrich snorted in derision and bent to examine something on the floor. "Get outside and keep watch then, but you aren't getting a full share of what I find." Uncaring about what could be looted from the burial chamber, Mikael half ran down the long, thin corridor towards the welcome sight of the stairs. Stepping from the cairn, he breathed in the cold air deeply, running a hand over his clammy forehead. Passing clouds hid the full moon for a moment, and shadows deepened. In the darkness there was movement, and Mikael felt his heart skip a beat. From the other cairns, spread in a semicircle around the largest of the burial mounds, came the sound of many slow, deliberate footfalls. Adorned in strange, ancient bronze armor, a parade of long-dead soldiers marched from the darkness of the crypts and arranged themselves into fighting formations. Strange totems were held by some of the skeletal soldiers, and others held silent bronze horns to fleshless lips. From one of the larger burial mounds, a bronze chariot emerged, pulled by the horrific vision of a pair of horses. flesh long since having fallen from their bones. As one, the skeletal legion began their advance, moving creakily towards Mikhail. Skeletal hands clutching ancient weapons. Footsteps sounded behind him. "We have to go, Heinrich," he stammered. Hearing no reply, Mikhail turned. Heinrich staggered into view, and Mikhail let out a groan of horror. The skin on Heinrich's face was gray and lined, as if he had aged a decade in the brief moments since he saw him. Heinrich raised a wrinkled hand, nails long and curling towards Mikhail in a silent plea. A heavy bronze blade suddenly chopped into Heinrich's neck from behind him, nearly severing his head from his body. With a gurgling sigh, he fell to the ground, blood fountaining from the terrible wound. Standing in the gloom was a mighty figure, bedecked in intricately carved, age-old bronze armor. No sound issued from Mikhail's throat, though inside, his soul screamed. Staring into the empty sockets of the once great king, he got the distinct impression that a cold intelligence still resided within this being. Mikhail remained silently screaming and unmoving, even as the first blades pierced his body. He dropped to the ground, to be trampled into the icy earth. Only then, with all evidence of the intruders gone, did the ancient warriors return to their cairns, to guard their abodes silently for the remainder of eternity. Angstag, 8th, Plugzent 2499. My good friend Jacob has at long last returned to Altdorf. After meeting him for a few ales in the Red Lion Tavern, he seemed very insistent on visiting the Magus Museum this very night. I persuaded him that whatever it was he so desperately needed to see could wait until a more decent and most definitely sober hour. My curiosity is now raised, though especially after he kept on ranting about the sarcophagus of the infant king Kaspek. My curiosity is now raised, though, especially after he kept on ranting about the sarcophagus of the infant king Kaspek. I have arranged with the curator for us to visit first thing in the morning. Festag, 9th. Incredible chance has fallen upon us. Upon entering the museum, Jacob headed straight to the newly refurbished Wonders of Ancient Nehekhara display. He spent a good hour scrutinizing the small casket of Kaspek with meticulous detail, barely able to control his excitement. He informed me that the Khepra pattern inset on the lid of the sarcophagus matches exactly a drawing on an ancient parchment he recently acquired from Araby. He also had on his possession a stone ankh, and claims it is the key to the tomb of Queen Rasut. I have promised to keep both items safe until his return in a month. Bakertag, 13th. After days of cross-referencing the parchment and extensive research, I have discovered that Queen Rasut was in fact Kapek's mother. How intriguing. I took Jacob's parchment to my good friend Alan Gartner. He deciphered the ancient hieroglyphs, and I am now in a state of total excitement. It would seem the key to unlocking the infant king's casket was placed in the burial chambers of his mother, Queen Rasut. Not only does the parchment detail the exact whereabouts of her tomb, but also how to gain access with the keystone. It would seem that inside the pyramid there lies a Khepra amulet, which when fixed onto the lid of Kospek's sarcophagus, will open the casket. There are a number of references to certain rites that must be performed to enter the burial chamber safely, but these sections are somewhat confusing and tedious. I dare say they are nothing more than ancient superstitions from a culture long since dead. Wellentag, 18th. It would seem that our good friend Alan Gartner is unable to hold his tongue. Yesterday, Clarissa Loft, a renowned collector of antiques from Nuln, but who I suspect is a little more than a glorified treasure hunter, paid the museum a visit and questioned me at some length about where the items we have on display were discovered. I feel that she knows more than she is letting on. When I returned to my chambers, I discovered that during my time in the company of Fräulein Loft, my room had been ransacked, and the Ankh key stolen. Bezaltag, 22nd. After many sleepless nights, I have decided that this matter is too important to leave until Jacob's return. Booking myself and my servant Klaus passage from the port of Marienburg to the city of El Haik. I have left instructions to Jacob as to the course of my actions. I can but hope that the next time I meet up with my good friend, together we shall unlock the secret wonders of the casket. Wellentag, 27th Somerset. It has been months since I last saw dry land, and now that I stand upon it I wish it were not quite so dry. The sun here is intolerable, and the stench of camels even worse. Within minutes of stepping on shore, I learned exactly why Al-Haik is known as the City of Thieves. Undaunted by the loss of my purse, I have been asking around about the location of the city of Khemri. It seems my questions have brought some unwarranted attention. A group of men swathed in black robes approached me, calling themselves the servants of the dead. They informed me my life will be at risk should I continue in my quest. I can only assume Clarissa has discovered I am in Nehekhara, and seeks to reach the pyramid without competition. This episode has only strengthened my belief in the expedition, and I shall set forth with all haste, lest Fräulein Loft arrive at the tomb before me. Aubentag, 28th. Klaus has managed to procure a guide to aid us in our quest. Tomorrow I venture into the vast desert with my guide Suli and his young nephew Arath. Today I instructed Klaus to buy provisions for our journey, including a good sword and a broad-rimmed hat to keep off the sun. I also asked him to find me a whip, for by the manners of the local camels I feel it will prove useful. Marktag, 29th. As suspected, my camel named Arborthanus has proved to be a veritable monster. It has a permanent state of flatulence and only travels where he so chooses. I tried using the whip on the creature, but it only served to aggravate the beast even more. I shall be glad when I am no longer forced to share its company, and I little doubt the feeling is mutual. Bezald, 30th. Yesterday the camel wandered away from my guides. At first I was unconcerned, as the beast does this on a daily basis, returning me around feeding time. This time our separation proved near fatal. Whilst traversing one of the many dunes that scatter this barren land, the sand before us suddenly erupted, and from it burst a monstrous beast. I recognized it to be a new species of scorpion, but it was as large as a farmer's cart, and branded with strange hieroglyphs. The creature attacked us, great pincers snapping and its fearsome stinger jabbing within inches of my face. I can only be thankful that Aberynthus was such a fast runner, as its cowardly flight no doubt saved us both. When I told my guides of this incredible beast, they merely shrugged. Perhaps they think I'm imagining things in the heat of the sun. Perhaps they are right. Angstag 9th, Vergheim. The small oasis we have stopped at seems like a veritable paradise compared to the harsh desert. It has been such a long time since I last saw any sight other than the monstrous glare of the desert sands. Late in the afternoon, Klaus made a remarkable discovery. On the far side of the small but mostly refreshing pool, he stumbled across an immense skeletal footprint. Although it certainly looked authentic, I can only guess it is the work of some Arabian prankster. Festag 17th. It has been a week since I last wrote in my journal, but truly there is little of noteworthy mention other than the constant heat of this accursed sun. This morning I spotted some large birds flying in the skies above our small group. As the afternoon wore on, the foul creatures flew low above our heads. From this distance, I could see that even the vultures have little to eat in these arid lands, for they looked as though they were starved to the very bone. I hope that the sight of these carrion eaters is not a bad omen. Audentag 27th, Nachgeim. Traveling across this wilderness has seemed to take an eternity, but at long last I have spied my first pyramid. The pinnacle of a huge black monolith appeared on the horizon, and the sun had nearly set before I noticed a second pyramid beside the massive construct. At the sight of the Black Pyramid, my guides made gestures to ward off evil. It confirms my beliefs that they are a superstitious civilization indeed. For me, the sight of this awesome tomb is indeed good news, for it means the destination of my journey is within sight, and I can at last be free of my camel. Bezeltag 5th. We have made camp in the old city. Tonight, as the sun sets and the intolerable heat has dissipated, I will make my way to the tomb. According to Jacob's rough map, the pyramid I seek lies exactly a mile to the southeast of the great tomb of Settra. The parchment shows a number of tombs located on the site. But how difficult can it be to locate a construction as large as a pyramid? Festag 9th. I don't believe it. How many of these damned pyramids did the people of this ancient civilization build? There must be hundreds of the accursed tombs. At long last, after countless hours studying Jacob's parchment, and 3 frustrating days wandering the labyrinth of streets, we have found the one we seek. As I suspected, Clarissa has arrived before me, for the doorway lay open. Why I tremble so at the thought of entering the tomb, I know not. As my mother always said, only fear the living, for the dead are at rest. I shall endeavor to make notes in my journal. What marvels lie before me I can but wonder, but it is my duty to record and map out these matters for posterity's sake.